Okay, just to quickly introduce myself, my name's Andy Austin. I'm a therapist based on the south coast of England. I'm an author and trainer. I teach other therapists how to do therapy. I'm not officially qualified, I have to make that clear. My stuff is more based reputation and experience-wise. Now, prior to the stuff that I'm doing today, I was a registered nurse, and one of the areas that I worked in was accidents and emergency, and subsequently worked in brain surgery, and a few other areas in between. Now, I'm also the other half. I'm the husband of Laura Robinson, who is the owner of Toxicology Consulting Limited. Now, one of the things that comes in fairly frequently to toxicology consulting are queries about poisoning, where when the data comes through, it's quite clear to everybody else, usually, except the victim, that no poisoning has ever occurred. But the person still presents with a whole bunch of symptoms that are seriously troublesome, both to the quality of life and their day-to-day, just basically overall health. So we have a person who has the experience where they're being poisoned. If we look at the data, the facts and all the details, they clearly haven't been, yet they're living the lifestyle of somebody who has been. Now, I want to just quickly go through the patterns that I'm aware of both as a therapist and a former clinician in accidents and emergency, where we would see this kind of behaviour fairly frequently. Now, the first big divide, we can take the whole chunk of these people, divide them into two. The fakers and the genuines. Now, the fakers will have a number of motives that they have. Some of them, it's nothing more than money. I've got to tell you, that's not very common. You see that more with injury. The person has had the accident, like the whiplash claim, that kind of stuff. And now I get what I deserve. So we have that kind of stuff, but that's not so common with the poisonings. With the fakers, it's more attention. And in accidents and emergency, there is a significant volume of people. In every hospital department across the world, they all see a group of patients who keep coming back again and again and again. Now, this week it might be they've harmed themselves, and next week it might be they've overdosed, or they've claimed to swallow razor blades, or this time have been poisoned. Pseudo-epilepsy, pseudo-asthma. On the first presentation or two, it's not very obvious what's going on. But when the person comes in, you go to the office, you pull out the medical file, and it's this thick. We used to weigh the notes of the regular attenders. It was kind of a slightly unprofessional in-joke to who was in the lead for having the set of notes that weighed the most. And we had regular attenders, frequent flyers, Munchausen's factitious disorder patients, who would literally come in on a daily basis. Some of them we would see more than once a day. I can remember one individual, unfortunately now she's deceased, she would come in regularly with ingestion. She didn't always ingest. Sometimes she did, sometimes she didn't. And one time she'd ingested sufficient amount, it put her in intensive care. When she'd recovered enough, she self-discharged from intensive care, went to the hospital shop, purchased some more tablets, and was swallowing them as she walked into the department and said, I've overdosed myself again. And this was the never-ending cycle until she did succeed, but I don't think that was ever her intent. So you get the Munchausen's, the factitious disorder people, who have something else going on. It's a need to be in that environment, to be cared for, to have the attention of medical professionals. And generally, these individuals are very consuming of other public services as well. So often they'll be well known to the police, they'll be well known to social services, they'll be well known in the housing office, the unemployment office, and all the other public support services that are available. These are very hardcore, about 4% of the population. It's a tiny group, but overall they present a massive burden. So that's one group. They're the outright fakers. Now, these are the group who are very unlikely to ever litigate. Because it's not about the money. They're not looking to punish another person. They don't feel they're trying to use this thing to leverage a power base against another human being. They're doing that by being victims. So they generally don't litigate. Now, the other group, who generally are moving towards litigation, they have something in common. They're absolutely genuine, even though there's nothing wrong with them. What's wrong with them is not what they think it is. Now, poisonings as a cultural phenomena, if you think about how it's represented in the media, in TV, in movies, the classic, the person's bitten by a snake, you have to cut the wound and suck it out and spit it out, and if that doesn't work, you rush them off to the doctor who gives them an antidote. Or people in the spy movies, they get the injection in the neck and they're immediately rendered ill. I've never seen anyone injected in the neck for anything, I have to tell you. They ingest something, and whilst they're having the glass of wine that's been poisoned, they start going, "What have you done to me? What have you done to me?" And then the other person says, "You have 8 hours to live. You tell me the secret or you're going to die. Tell me the secret and I'll give you the antidote." You know, that kind of stuff. So the media representation of poisoning isn't quite how things work. Some poisons are rapidly fatal. Some poisons, they take years before anything shows up. And some poisons affect people for a duration of time, and then it flushes out the system, and then it's no problem. Sometimes it gets into the system, biological processes then are engaged, and there's a sequelae later on down the line. It doesn't always work the way people think it works. So, for example, one family that I know have had this lifelong thing, what's wrong with us? We're always tired, we're always irritable, we're quick-tempered, lots of insomnia, never quite feel right. And what they've engaged in over the years is, are we being poisoned? So what we've had is the carpets have all been removed. The walls have all been stripped down, maybe it's something in the paint. They've moved house several times. Furnitures have been stripped out. Various linens and dyes and colours were looked at. Then food, it was cheese for a period of time, and then maybe it was dairy, maybe there were things in the food, so it's food intolerances. Then it's the environment, maybe it's traffic pollution. So they move again. This ongoing saga of what's wrong with us. Now, to anybody else looking at this family, what's wrong with them is very, very clear. They're very highly stressed, they're very irritable, and they trigger each other off with their irritations. They need to relax a little bit. But they don't see it that way. For them, the general consensus, the explanation of what's wrong with us as a family group, well, actually it's just the parents, is we must be being poisoned by something. And their houses have been endlessly inspected and tested for all sorts of stuff. Now, as far as I know, these people have never engaged in litigation, but the mindset of, I just don't feel quite right, I'm just irritable, there's something wrong, there must be an external causation, is part of the pattern that can happen. Now, they don't have what we call the explanatory event. They've just had this evolution of stuff over time. For many people, there's an event which becomes the explanation of what is wrong. Now, some of the problems that the person links to the event may have been there before. It may well be they've never really noticed it until this event happens. Sometimes there's a degree of coincidence, like I'm fine, there's this event, I'm now not fine, I blame the event. And sometimes there's a time delay when the person starts thinking years later, so what is it? Maybe I was poisoned. When have I ever been exposed to anything that could have poisoned me? Oh, I remember that time I went to the swimming pool and it was really strong chlorine, a few years ago. Maybe it was that. So there's a linkage that happens, and the person identifies either an explanatory event or series of events. Once that connection is made, the person is now going to seek to find out more about the event. Now, generally, there's nothing to find out. Okay, there was a smell that wafted over from the fields. There was a smell of chlorine. Sure, the tea tasted a bit strange in that restaurant and I didn't drink it. And that's an unusual thing because I never have a bad cup of tea. These kind of things. But actually, when it then gets investigated, nothing turns up. Now, the investigation can often happen quite some time after the event has happened, of course. Now, to the person who feels, I've got all these symptoms, I know it was that cup of tea, I know it was that restaurant, I know it was that farmer's field, and now nothing's showing up. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? They're clearly covering it up. So now what we have is a sense of injustice as well as a sense of illness. And the injustice now kind of drives the negative things that are going on inside me. Therefore, I now have more determination, but also I might start to feel iller. So we get this horrible feedback cycle. Now I can go to my doctor, and the doctor says he doesn't know what's wrong with me. That translates as, as a doctor, I can't find anything medically wrong with this patient. But the patient says, the doctors don't know what's wrong with me. And they may subject themselves to all sorts of weird and wonderful investigations, both medically. They may even get dismissed. They may go back to their doctor repeatedly. The doctor tries to reassure them, but the client's not reassured. They may then engage in all sorts of weird New Age investigations. Here's a classic one. I've seen this several times now. Kinesiology. This is basically one of these nonsense investigations that non-doctors will do. They write the substance, the name of the substance on a piece of paper, and you hold it in your fist. And they try and pull down on your arm, and if you're weaker than when they pulled down when you didn't have the piece of paper, there you go. Your body knows. So now, for some people, they're trusting. I'm loath to use the word gullible, because I'm not entirely sure that's fair. People tend to be very believing of the truth, and they believe other people tell the truth. Kinesiologists who do this nonsense are generally people who believe that that's the truth. They're not lying, they believe it's true. So when that gets conveyed, now we have a patient who has all these symptoms, all nondescript aches and pains. I just feel a bit lethargic, a bit irritable. I get these headaches. I get dry mouth. I just don't feel right most of the time. I get stomach aches, blah, 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 blah. The doctors don't know what's wrong. The farmer won't admit that he was using the wrong chemicals that I smelt that day. And now I have other people who are giving me time. They're taking me seriously. They're giving me attention. No one else seems to be trusting me. They don't take me seriously. They don't believe me. My kinesiologist or whatever therapist they're seeing, they understand me. Now, the person will find supporters. It's increasingly easy. It may not be, say, the kinesiologist that supports some more New Age therapy. They can go online and find forums and discussion groups where other people have got exactly the same symptoms and they too have been poisoned. And guess what? They can't find anything. The doctors dismiss them. No one takes them seriously. The person who poisoned them clearly denies it, and there's all a big cover-up. Now what we have are, say, a dozen people in remote parts of the world all coming together with what appears to be an identical story. Now it's not. What it is, but not for the reasons they think it is. They now have got evidence, as far as they're concerned, that something big is going on, but actually nothing's going on. That's the whole point. The thing they have in common is nothing's happening, and this is the response set that happens from healthcare professionals when nothing's wrong. They don't see it that way. So now what you have is a situation where the person now is desperately needing to uncover the truth. Now, they may not necessarily participate in those forums and discussions, but they will start to gather more and more information that proves it to them. Now, all the time that this is going on, so is normal life. And normal life is also throwing up stresses and illnesses and health concerns and problems. You see, even paranoid people have people out to get them. Even hypochondriacs get ill. And this is quite important, because what now starts to happen is, whereas I might just have a cough and a cold, and I've just had a second one in the space of 6 weeks. It's that time of year, I've just gone down twice with serious colds. Like, what's going on? I know it's just viruses. It's that time of year. Partly the weather conditions facilitate that. But if I'm somebody who's been poisoned, if I'm somebody who thinks I've been poisoned, and I'm somebody who there's a cover-up going on, and I'm seeing similar patterns on the internet happening with other people, and they're having the same difficulty, and no one's taking me seriously, and the doctors dismiss me, I know there's something wrong. My immunity is terrible. Ever since this has happened, I now have such a problem with my... And then my kinesiology, you see how this works. Now, so often the person will now litigate for one primary reason. The money is largely irrelevant. Although, by the time that they go for litigation, the costs to them are very, very high. Often they've dropped out of work. They've not been at work for so long, they may have lost their job, they may have been half pay, the job may have been closed for them, they may have been dismissed, they may now have be chronically unemployed. And the attempts to uncover further information can get costly. So to try and get this report, that report, to go and see this expert, that expert, these costs mount up. So now, this is part of the stuff they're looking for compensation for. Because it's not just, I want them punished, like the American punitive litigation. What they're after is genuine compensation. But the person who they identify as the source may not have anything to do with any of this that's going on. The difficulty is, and this seems to be the pattern, the person who feels that they've been poisoned will not accept that this is a psychological problem. They won't accept that this is it's not all in my head. Look at me, I've got a rash. And you look, and they generally do have a rash. They may not understand that this actually could be a psychological thing. There's magazines that facilitate this mindset. Food Intolerance Weekly, I think it's actually a monthly magazine, where now everyone's got food intolerances. This is an explanatory event for some people. Multiple chemical sensitivity. There is such a condition, there really is, probably for about 10 people on the planet. But we know that with things like multiple chemical sensitivity, for the majority of people, it's actually a problem with smell. And with poisoning cases, most of the time it's a taste or a smell that is linked to the triggering event. Now, there's a really good biological reason why this is the case. There's the cultural belief about monosodium glutamate in food, MSG in Chinese food. People all think they get bloated after eating. That's a cultural belief that's total nonsense. It's very much a Western thing, that MSG. Plenty of studies have been done, whereas if you give people food and you put MSG in it and don't tell them, they don't notice the effect. Give them food, tell them there's MSG in it, they'll go, oh yeah, I feel a bit bloated afterwards. It's an auto-suggestion type thing going on there. So there's a cultural value that's being enacted. People move towards conformity most of the time, and the cultural value of I've eaten MSG, therefore I feel bloated, is a rational thing for people to do, even though it's irrational. Now, all sensory data from the world, touch and hearing and sight, all that stuff, all gets routed through a portion of the brain for processing, and then that information gets sent out all other areas. The sense of smell doesn't. The sense of smell bypasses that processing area, and it goes straight into, basically, the information goes straight through emotions and memory and all sorts of other stuff. It's why you can catch the whiff of a perfume of somebody or an aftershave of somebody who walks past you in the street and instantly reminds you of a lost loved one from 20, 30 years ago. Smells are incredibly powerful, incredibly evocative of various things. Now, smell, basically, the action of smell inside the mind bypasses conscious intervention. Okay, that's really important. It bypasses conscious intervention. So when people smell something and they have a disgust reaction, it's very hard to not do that. Children have a biological program in there. When one kid vomits, I hate to say that, I'm sorry to say this, but you probably notice that children's vomit has a distinct type of smell to it as opposed to adult vomit. And most people, if they smell children's vomit, it's like, ooh, I was a nurse, I'm familiar with these things. But generally, when one child is sick, it generally triggers a vomiting reflex in other children. This is sort of a primeval survival thing. The smell triggers that response. And all the kids start going, and then before you know it, the teacher has a bit of a mess on their hands. So you remove the vomiting child as quickly as you can. Smell bypasses conscious intervention. Now, for some people, what happens is they have a particular stress event happening, and then there's a smell. They haven't necessarily recognized that they're stressed. But the stress gets attached to the smell, because that's just, things get paired together. It's called anchoring in some fields of psychology. So these are anchored together. And it's very hard for the person to have any conscious rationalization of that process, because it's automatic and it happens without conscious intervention. So this category of people, unlike the fakers, this category of people genuinely, 100%, think they're ill. Because biologically, that is what their nervous system is telling them. It's telling them that this thing has affected them. And the memory now of that thing is usually heavily encoded with smell or taste. And in all of the cases that we've had come through, where it's clearly a factitious poisoning, so that the person's genuinely ill, but there was no poisoning that made them ill, there is another explanation for the events. All of them were genuine people. But it didn't matter that we were appoint an expert to them who can explain this to them, even though doctors have told them, physicians and therapists, the psychiatrist, the lawyers that they saw initially have all told them there is clearly nothing here that tells you that you're in poison, this is a stress response. They're never going to believe that. And it's a very, very unfortunate thing for those individuals. As a therapist, and this is an area that I work with, it is a very, very difficult thing because the belief for them now is so strong because they have sensory, physical data to their everything about them says, you're wrong, I know my body and I'm not well. And they're absolutely correct by that. But of course, then they're correct, but for all the wrong reasons. Now, if you want to know more about things like factitious poisoning, I'm not an expert on this, I have to tell you. I'm more sort of the guy that works. I've worked with those people in a first-line treatment process, but also I'm now the therapist that works with those people afterwards. I'm not really the person who gets involved in the litigation aspect. But so if you're a lawyer or a litigant and you want to know a little bit more about this kind of stuff and want to talk things through with me, contact me via Laura Robinson. I'm not an official part of Toxicology Consulting. I'm the husband of the person who owns the company. You understand? So if you want to know more, contact Laura and she can pass the details over to me. All details are in the strictest confidence. I offer the same client confidentiality to an inquiry such as this as I would in any other context, as does Laura. Laura does talks and training in toxicology and these things. If you're a law firm and you want to know more about the litigation and toxicology side as opposed to the psychological side, which is what I do, also please contact Laura. The details are either up there on that link or one down there, wherever it is on this video.